When a complex crisis strikes, leadership is tested. Decisions must be made in seconds, and the right call can mean the difference between disaster and resilience. So, are you really ready for the moment when everything is on the line? Welcome to Season 4 of the Crisis Lab podcast, a show where we break down the toughest challenges in crisis management, emergency response, and risk leadership. And with every episode, we go beyond the headlines, dissecting real-world, complex crises with those who were on the front lines. That includes leaders, decision makers, and experts who've navigated unprecedented challenges and lived to tell the story. This season, we're pushing the boundaries, from cybersecurity threats that can cripple entire nations to high-stakes disaster response and the unseen risks lurking in global supply chains. Season 4 is all about new frontiers of complex crisis leadership. We're bringing you the exclusive interviews with top emergency planners, intelligence insiders, and world-class strategists who will reveal what it really takes to prepare for, respond to, and recover from a complex crisis. But that's not all. So if you lead, manage risk, or simply want to understand how the world stays standing when everything falls apart, then this season is for you. So hit subscribe, follow us on your favorite podcast platform, and join us as we pull back the curtain on the world of complex crisis leadership. Because in a crisis, knowledge isn't just power, it's survival. All right, everybody, welcome to the Crisis Lab podcast. My name is Kyle, and I'll be your host. And today we are going to explore the idea of design thinking and human-centered design thinking. And in order to do that, we're bringing Rick Fernandez on the show today, and he's going to unpack this topic a little bit more for us and explain how this can help us improve our planning processes, our community resilience, and our overall organizational resilience. So, Rick, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
So as we start to unpack this topic a little bit more, I would just like to maybe start out first with who you are and your background, and then we can start unpacking this topic a little bit more.
Yeah. For the listening audience, I am Rick Fernandez. I'm currently based in DC. My career has taken some twists and turns. I started my career working at the U.S. Department of Justice, working on international police assistance programs. Then in what I like to refer to the core of my career, I did AmeriCorps, and I had the wonderful opportunity to talk to New York City-based faith communities to help them get better prepared for disasters. That led into a wonderful 5 years with the New York City Emergency Management Department, where I was a planner with the Human Services team. Then I took a look at my career and thought, well, I've done interagency work when I was at the Department of Justice because our programs were international and therefore they were funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development or the State Department. At the Justice Department, always working with people from the U.S. Agency for International Development or the State Department. At my time at the New York City Emergency Management Department, I was a public sector, nonprofit sector partnership person because I was from the government, the public sector, but I needed to work with New York City voluntary organizations active in disaster member organizations. I had about 30 different nonprofit partners that I needed to interact with. So I knew from early on in my career, I knew government to government agency partnerships. At New York City EM, I knew government to nonprofit partnerships. And I asked myself, if I really want to have impact in the world, I really need to start looking at the private sector. And then I thought, who are the people that are easiest for me to start working with or thinking about how to work with? And it came to me, corporate social responsibility offices at corporations, social entrepreneurs who blend, bringing market forces to bear on what we normally think, at least in the US, is nonprofit sector problems, right? Social impact investing, social impact bonds. And I took a certificate program on that, led to a wonderful capstone project in Nairobi, Kenya, where I got to scout out social enterprises for possible investment. That transitioned to some time at IBM, where I worked on one of the largest international corporate volunteer programs in the world. And then after that, I missed response. So I did some international humanitarian time in South Sudan. So the main threads through that winding career is partnerships, getting different types of people to work together. And when you get interested in those things, you very quickly land on design thinking because it's a process that brings together, that focuses on bringing together, people with different skill sets and different minds in order to address common problems.
Yeah, thanks for that overview. And it sounds very much like a wide and diverse career and set of experiences that brought you to this point today, which is really focusing on design thinking and how we apply that to crisis and emergency management. So I would just start off because it probably helped just to clarify a couple of quick points. So there's that design thinking aspect, which is really, at least in my current understanding, associated more with sort of product innovation, tech innovation space as well. And then in the course and also what your experience has been really centered around human-centered design thinking and its
Right.
application towards
Right.
a lot of your work. So just a quick overview of your perspective on human-centered design thinking and how does this apply to a lot of the work that we do and others do that are listening in terms of maybe emergency management and planning, or if they're in the nonprofit space or whatever the case is.
Right off the bat, design thinking is always, writ large, design thinking is always focused on the end user. Like you said, it comes out of the private sector. It's always thinking about the end user. So the customer that's going to receive your product. Human-centered design, which is extremely related and very similar, and there's lots of overlap, is following a similar process, but actively engaging those people a little bit more directly. In design thinking, you start with thinking about who you're trying to serve. And in human-centered design, you're actively doing interviews and that type of thing. But for the most part, at least for this conversation, we can use those two things interchangeably. Now, how design thinking relates to military planning, humanitarian planning, development planning, and emergency management planning is that key word, planning, right? In each one of those disciplines, if you're a planner, you need to think about who's affected by this problem, how are they affected by this problem, what can I do to alleviate that problem, how do we get a simple version of that problem to a point where we can test it. And then once we've tested it, how do we change it enough so that it's ready so that we can deliver that solution? And then once we deliver that solution, that's when the real work begins, because then you have real world feedback on that solution because the people you're trying to serve have actually received your solution and they can say, this is our experience with the solution you developed. I like to think of design thinking as a secondary planning language that any planner can use. And that if all of us learn that second language, then we'll be able to plan with each other without abandoning or replacing our structured planning processes that we've been trained on in each one of our disciplines.
That was actually addressing my next question as we continue this conversation, which is it sounds, at least on the surface, people might confuse that as being, okay, this needs to replace our planning process.
Mhm.
And you're saying it's more of an overlay or a type of supplemental process that we have along with the regular planning that we're doing.
Yes, exactly right. The design thinking process has 5 steps. You empathize with the end user or the recipient of your product or service. You define what their problem is, right? Then you ideate. That's a fancy way of saying you come up with possible solutions. Then you prototype those solutions, right? And then you test those prototypes. In each one of our in the planning disciplines that we mentioned before, everybody does it. You know, when a military planner or humanitarian planner or emergency management planner or development planner takes the jargon out of what they do to explain it to a family member at a gathering, it's going to sound a lot like design thinking, right? So again, design thinking shouldn't replace your processes. Each field has developed those processes based on its subject matter expertise, executing the mission that each one of those institutions has. Leave it alone. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But I think military professionals, development professionals, humanitarian professionals, and you could argue that emergency management professionals getting different types of experts to work together is emergency management, right? If that's the job, right, then you need to find a way to get them to work together. And design thinking can be one of those ways. In addition to just augmenting your already rigorous structured planning processes that you already have in your own institutions.
So that's interesting in the aspect. So I hear what you're saying, and I think that there's right or wrong in the world of emergency management today. We do a lot of capability based planning. We look at how can we respond? There's a heavy emphasis on response, which tends to be fast, structured, decisive, and things like that. But design thinking, on the other hand, really emphasizes what you were saying, sort of these iterations, the plans, the discussions. And this all sounds contradictory to a fast moving response to a disaster or a crisis. How do these work together at the end of the day? How are
Right.
you selling somebody, I guess I would say, who is so focused on response? We need to take a step back and look at how we integrate this human centered design thinking.
So design thinking can be inserted into your planning process. So one, it doesn't replace it, as we said before. The other thing is that you're not always doing response. Even though you're a responder, response elements have planning cells that are developing plans prior to crisis. So you can certainly, and that's when your deliberate planning process is used in your own agency. So any deliberate planning process, pre-crisis, however you want to define it, the planning that you do before the bad thing you're planning against actually occurs. Whenever you're doing that, you have time to insert design elements of design thinking into your process. Immediately upon a crisis occurring, there is, of course, a period of time where rapid decisions need to be made, right? Life safety issues need to be addressed. Critical life survival needs need to be met, right? After that point, responses, not recovery yet, but responses stabilize to a point where today looks a lot like yesterday, and you're pretty sure tomorrow is going to look a lot like today. That's when you have time to use design thinking within your own planning to iterate on your ongoing operations. And then for when you started for recovery, you have to answer the question when you start recovery planning, you have to start by answering the question, what does fixed look like? Everybody agrees everything's broken or a significant amount of things were broken. Otherwise, it wouldn't be an emergency. What does fixed look like? And you better have a wide stakeholder base in order to define that. Otherwise, you're going to have several problems. You're going to have political problems. You're going to have implementation problems. You're going to have continual discussions over about resource allocations. I think only in that narrow initial parts of a crisis where life safety operations need to be conducted and life sustaining operations that meet survival needs are ongoing, only in that sliver of time, which I think we give a little bit too much of mental headspace to, because I think it's shorter in reality than we like to think it is. Only in that space, maybe you don't use design thinking. But in that sliver of time, there is emergency action planning. There are planning cycles. And you do need to talk to people in order to do that specific type of rapid planning. So, and I do know of an organization that's operating in the Ukraine that is using human-centered design that is even more collaborative, more deliberate than pure design thinking. So in the context of a war, human-centered design, the more interactive, the more time-consuming form of design thinking is being applied. So there's always going to be a need for haste. There's always going to be a need for decisive operations. But to the extent that we have time to plan and plan rationally and deliberately with a lot of different partners, when you have space to plan that way, you have space to incorporate design thinking elements into your already existing planning processes.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you're saying, what does right actually look like? What is fixed? I think you said, right? So what is fixed? And that you need to have a wide stakeholder base in order to be fixed, quote unquote, right? Whatever fixed looks like. And I think it's interesting because you can't force fixed solutions, right? Because they're
Right.
not sustainable either. So there has to be an engagement with your base, your communities, the people that you're taking care of if you are in that response phase. And what I see is, as I listen to you explaining this and the methodology behind human-centered design thinking, is that really I could see two sort of critical areas where there's some friction. I'll just put it that way. One is really in probably organizational culture, and then I think also in terms of organizational structures. And so organizational culture saying this is just too slow And it'll take so much of our time to go talk to people. I can just immediately feel that sort of
Yeah.
reaction from having been in this space for a while. And then on the organizational culture side, I could see that, especially if we're talking about military aspects or humanitarian
Yeah.
operations with the military, it's a very fixed structure, hierarchical, and
Mhm.
very structured in its environment. So where design thinking generally thrives in more open, collaborative settings, I guess I would say. So how do you
Mhm.
navigate both of these tensions? One on the culture side of like, I don't want to wait, sort of spend my time engaging and listening to
Mhm.
1,000 people, which
Right.
that's not necessarily what you would do, but okay, we'll
Right.
just use that as an example for
Yeah.
this purposes of this discussion. But then, and
Right.
then also the organizational hierarchy sort of restrictions and structure.
Right. So the military emergency management, right? There are deliberate planning processes that already, as an intrinsic part of those processes, brings different experts together, right? The only difference is how are we defining who's in and who's out, right? They wear uniforms, even though it's slightly different from mine, right? In the military case, is it joint branches of the same national military or combined elements of different national militaries, right? That's their only question. Maybe their operations officers has responsibilities that our plans officer does. I'm talking about military staffs. Maybe that's different, but we can get it, right? The reason why they don't think of those people as other is because the processes are similar. So that's why I'm advocating for design thinking being a separate and secondary planning language that can be common to all different types of planners. No one's asking any professional to not be an exemplar of their profession, just saying, okay, for the people that are outside of the boundaries of who I consider the people I could work with, how do I create a secondary perimeter where I can meet that person and from another profession and work with them? Right. So, what's the middle ground, the common planning space that we can work together? And what's the common language that we can use when we're working together, even though we're from different professions and are fluent in our own jargons, but maybe only speak jargon from the other professions, right? But your question does hint on something. Things move at the speed of trust, right? So it does take time. I hate this term, but the time suck is developing the relationships so that you can call somebody and bring them into a meeting so that you can plan together. You can't cold call somebody and expect them to do that. You can hope, but you can't expect them to do it in any sort of mechanistic way. One of the first emergency management adages the old salty dogs taught me was this is when we all still had business cards because everything was hard copy. You don't want to be exchanging business cards for the first time during the response, right? If you're at an incident site and there's somebody that you can work with that you need to work with in order to conduct the response, and you're just meeting them for the first time and you need to exchange business cards, chances are you didn't plan well enough. You got to develop those relationships. Maybe if not the people in theater, at least my home office has talked to your home office. And now that we're in the host nation, we can work together. So I think that speaks to the culture side. On the organization side, inter-organization, inter-entity collaboration does take place, right? It takes place in CIMICs. It takes place in emergency operations centers. It takes place in the context of a peacekeeping mission where there's military, police, civilian, and humanitarian elements, all part of the same organizational structures. On the organization side, if your boss creates a structure for you to interrelate with people from other organizations, that collaboration can take place. So I think your question points to the two stumbling blocks. And I think your question also points to the fact that we figured out how to have different types of organizations talk to each other and work together at speed, right? Because each one of the communities that we're talking about has learned how to do that. And if not hosting, then at least collaborating in those spaces. But the biggest limiting factor to collaboration is the trust, is the how do we trust people enough to view them in a way that they can help us with our planning and we can help them with theirs. And we can work on solutions that maybe not fully integrated, but do support each other.
Hey, just a quick break to remind you that the toughest decisions don't come with a warning. The people who handle them best are the ones who prepare in advance. At Crisis Lab, we explore how professionals across the various different sectors think ahead, manage risk, and make sound decisions under pressure. Get ahead of the next challenge. Check out crisislab.io today. I think you hit on a good point, which was that, if they plan like us, then we're more familiar with them. And then we probably have an accelerated rate of trust
Right.
with them because we understand their planning process, and that trust, the speed of trust is obviously, I think,
Right.
critically important. We've been seeing more of this trust factor coming up post Hurricane Milton and other sort of more complex disasters that have happened recently in the US, where trust has become a question. Regardless of perspective on it, it's now been introduced as a factor that we have to plan for. I guess I'll
Mhm.
just put it that way. But this is where I can also see there's a bit of a comment, or I think there's a perspective that would exist when I hear you explain the process and how we layer this into our existing planning and our day-to-day operations and have community engagement and working with a lot of partners. And you ultimately will get to a point where you say, okay, I've done that. And what I have identified is that they all have different priorities. They all have different processes, just like we were talking about. So how do I balance, in this process, everybody's different organizational needs? You mentioned that you were working with different organizations and coordinating the largest donor sort of sectors within the private sector. How are you balancing, or what are the insights you have about balancing priorities across multiple organizations to try and achieve a certain common outcomes when everybody has their own limitations at the end of the day and their own processes that you have to contend with?
That question points to a very large scale, but I think the dynamics are true of even a small scale, right? Those dynamics between how do we get the African Union to collaborate with different elements of the United Nations and the international humanitarian sector. And oh, by the way, in the place that they're trying to operate together is seen as a frontier market by some of the major corporations on the planet. So they want to get their corporate social responsibility programming involved somehow, right? Like, how do we get all these people to work together? Because they sort of want similar things. They're going to be operating in the same space, and everything they do affects everything everybody else does, right? That's true at that level, but it's also true at, the Sunday church potluck special event, right? Collaboration is hard. I don't think you can have too many modes, modalities, strategies for collaboration. The more, the merrier. I think what design thinking offers as far as trust building, people trust you if they know you've not only heard them, but listened to them. That doesn't necessarily mean do what they say, but you've internalized how they are defining their problem to enough where you can repeat your conceptualization of their problem to them, and their eyes open up and say, yes, you've heard me. That can get you a long way towards collaboration. And then once you have enough of a defined big problem, right, then you can start steering towards it. You're not going to get the level of details of 2 blocks, make a right, then make a left, and then look up, you're going to see X. You're going to get, we're all generally heading east together for for the foreseeable future. And you've all defined ways where we don't get in each other's way, and we all help each other as necessary along the way as well. One part of, or let me put it this way. One of the things that I like to think about this stuff is that partnership is never easy. It's a practice, but you need to know what you want out of a partnership, what your specific needs are, right? And then you need to be sensitive to your potential partner's interests, needs, and boundaries. What are they trying to achieve? What do they need to achieve it? And what are the lines, if crossed, will kill the partnership? So you stay within their boundaries, right? You try to be sensitive to what they need, and you try to develop a partnership that's mutually beneficial. And doing that between 2 partners is challenging. Doing that between multiple partners in the same room can get very complex, but it takes a lot of facilitation and a lot of nurturing, but it can be done. And like I said before, the different fields that we're discussing have created structures where we can at least have a space to do that. If the EOC is the physical or virtual space where all agencies can pile into and start talking to each other, design thinking is the intellectual space where different experts can talk to each other and come up with joint solutions.
Okay, so we've dived into sort of the human aspect a bit. I want to shift the conversation a little bit over towards the integration of technology, because I don't think we can just dismiss technology overall in terms of the impact it's going to have in really all that we do. So, evolution of AI, analytics, predictive analytics, digital sort of crisis management tools. You mentioned EOCs and how the use of technology is enhancing all of that. So, how do you see design thinking evolving with the integration of technology?
Well, design thinking, design generally, and design thinking specifically is always evolving because creative minds flock to things like design thinking, right? Designers are creative types, so they're always bringing in new elements or rediscovering things that were used in the past that maybe have fallen out of fashion. So design and design thinking, that's always going to evolve naturally. I think there's a big overlap between the types of people we're talking about and pure designers, just the way they operate intellectually. I think I'm going to be entering some dangerous waters because it's a civilian quoting Clausewitz, but I think in Clausewitz on War, he says command resides within the domain of the creative or something like that, right? Design is going to evolve because creative people like to add to what they do and how they do it. Planners are the same way. I think junior emergency managers, they love emergency management. They love the emergency of emergency management, right? But they get older and they get more experienced. And then they realize emergency management is rooted in the second part of it, the management on their bookshelf early on in their career. It's mostly after action reviews and different reports on different capabilities that are coming down the line and ICS this and FEMA that. And then more and more management consultants like Jim Collins or books. So what was a kind of cult classic in emergency managers was the Checklist Manifesto. You start seeing books like that. Stuff's going to evolve, right? Because designers and planners are rapidly evolutionary beings, right? They're always looking for the new thing. What's the new thing that can help me do my job better? And how do I apply it? And how do I rejigger it? How do I translate it? They're both doing that. So whether it's AI or another tool, they're going to be doing that, right? I'm going to tip my hat to the younger generations. I just slam them for maybe not evolving quick enough to the point where they start studying management books more and after action reviews. That's but one of the things that they are light years ahead of me on is the adaptation of new types of technology, whether it's AI or anything else, right? What you have is digital natives coming into fields that require design and planning. So those two things are not going to be separate. They're going to be braided because they're already integrated inside those people. In the same way that I can't say to one of those people, say, how does your right arm work for you, work with your left? The question's absurd to that person, right? They're like, above a certain age, that question, like, how are you integrating technology into what you do? That question only makes sense for a person above a certain age. Below a certain age, they're like, I use technology fluidly and without thinking in everything I do. So planning and, my job is part of the everything I do. So I don't understand your question. So those folks will inherit more of our jobs and rightfully so. And I'm glad because I don't have to answer. I won't have to answer that specific question in how I do things. They'll help me.
Yeah, I think that's hilarious. I think you hit a lot of really good points there, especially on the being digitally integrated
Right.
by the time you get to a field and practice emergency management.
Right.
It is hilarious though, what you're talking about. You're in love with the emergency of emergency management, and you still see that it is pretty pervasive throughout the community. And recently, I had a lot of discussions around the idea of what would the world look like if response wasn't even necessary. And it's a complete reframing of what you
Mm.
do focus on when you first start your career. Because I came out of the emergency
Right.
services and was in love
Mm.
with the idea of response and getting a call. And then
Yeah.
now that you're at a point in your career when you grow into different ideas and get more exposure and more experience, you start to
Right.
say, maybe we don't even need to respond at all. What would that world look like? with better design, better communities, better architecture, better codes and standards. Is response itself just a indication of failure, right?
Right. Right.
And so this is where it starts to become more interesting to what you're talking about.
And the true professionals know how to do things with grace and without a lot of energy expenditure, right? That's the highest level of mastery, when you can have the same effects with minimal energy expenditure and a reduced level of activity, right? That's when true mastery is. And I think that's what, at their heart, emergency managers and military planners, and certainly humanitarians and development professionals want, right? We want these impacts, right? And we want to have a positive impact, because each one of those people are service-minded folks. I think you're really insightful saying that, do we want to serve or do we want to be of service? Because if it's about our serving, maybe we're not being as much service as possible, right? Because if our serving means you're suffering, then maybe I'm not going to explore solutions where I'm not needed, right? If that's truly what I'm about, the act of serving, then maybe I'm waiting for that bell to ring, right? And maybe I'm not pushing things not to happen so the bell doesn't ring, right? But that, oddly enough, looks like you're not doing anything when you make things that way, right? But that's the highest form of service, because then people aren't affected. I think that's a wonderful quality. I think that's the most human quality that any human being can have. But we can't get addicted to it. And we can't be afraid of working ourselves out of a role if that means a better outcome and better impact for the communities we care about.
That's a great way to wrap up the show today. Thanks, Rick, for joining us. I think it was very insightful, very sort of poignant conversation that we're having today, especially around human-centered design thinking. And really appreciate you being here. And thanks a lot. And if anybody is interested, you can check out Rick's course on Crisis Lab. It's launching pretty soon. And then how can anybody get in touch with you if they want to reach out to you, Rick? Is LinkedIn the best way?
Yeah, LinkedIn is the best way. And just reach out. I have grown to not be a fan of the unsolicited, please let's connect. Please like LinkedIn says itself, you get more connection requests favorably responded to if you actually put a note. So please put a note. And I think from our time together, you can sense that I love to talk. So if you're chatting with me, I'll be chatting with you. And if you think I can help you in any way serve others, or as we've just landed on, be of service to each other, not just serve, then I'll certainly do my best to help out.
All right. That sounds great, Rick. And thanks again for joining us. And to everybody else, have a great day. And we'll see you on the next podcast.
Thanks so much.